Welcome back. I'm David Knight, and joining us now is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. I want to get a couple of people, John Rappaport and Sherry Tenpenny, on to talk about this vaccine issue, because I think this is very serious. And Sherry has at her site, Vaxter.com, that's VAXXTER.com, a couple of articles that push back on what the mainstream media is telling us about this flu epidemic. And let me just give you a couple of headlines. U.S. News, a century after a pandemic, science takes its best shot at the flu. So making comparisons to the massive number of deaths in the flu, from the flu during World War I and after World War I. LA Times, again, coming into this wartime analogy. California hospitals face a war zone of flu patients. They're setting up tents to treat them. It's a crisis. They're trying to triage these people. The flu deaths are continuing to climb. Bloomberg, you think flu season is bad? It might get even worse. And then we've got the Bonham Independent School District, right outside of Dallas-Fort Worth, cancels school for a week, effective this last Tuesday. So from this last Tuesday till next Tuesday, they have canceled school because of the flu. So joining us now is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. You can find her at tenpennyimc.com. The website, again, the news website is Vaxter.com, VAXXTER.com. And her Twitter account is BusyDRT, Busy Dr. T. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Tenpenny.
Thank you, David. Thanks for inviting me back.
Oh, thank you. Always happy to talk to you. I mean, always have a lot of information about vaccines in particular, but you've got a pushback against the statistical revelations that are coming out of the CDC. The CDC is telling everybody, don't worry about the false alarm in Hawaii. We've got a new false alarm for you, although they don't tell you that it's a false alarm. Now they're saying, we're going to forget about nuclear issues. We're going to go right after the flu, and they're panicking everybody. And as I just read, we got all the mainstream media backing them up on this. But what did you find in your looking into these figures?
Well, I've looked at these figures over the last 19 years, and I look at the CDC weekly surveillance report where they have 120 centers across the country, and patients go there that have flu-like symptoms, which is fever, cough, deep body aches, and they do a nasal swab and a throat swab, and they send it to the CDC, and the first thing they do is they test it to see if it's positive for influenza viruses or not. And that's when when it is positive for influenza viruses, then they subtype it to see, is the influenza viruses out there in the circulation the same influenza viruses that are in the vaccine? And that's how they do the testing to see whether or not there's a match between the flu shot and what's out there in the environment. Well, what's really interesting is that this year, with all this big hype about the flu, is that when they send all of those samples, over 300,000 samples have already been sent to the CDC. Only 12.8% of those, 12.8%, test for influenza. And so wow. Real influenza is caused by influenza viruses. Fake influenza is influenza-like illness that can be caused by something else. So my big question is what is causing the other 87 or 88% of flu-like symptoms out there that's making people so sick? Because it's not influenza viruses, and therefore the influenza vaccine has no bearing whatsoever.
That is amazing, because you pointed out you've been looking at this for 19 years. And this is very low. You said this is actually less than has been identified over the last 19 years, and yet you've got the entire mainstream media following in on this CDC false alarm. I mean, this is like what they did in Hawaii, pushing the button. You know, this is not a drill. This is not a drill. We got a flu epidemic, do this, and yet it's less than that. And I find it interesting that when you talk about, in your article, you point out 372,000 tests at their 120 testing centers. Very detailed information here, and people can find this at Vaxter.com. The article is Statistical Revelations Seem to Disprove, quote, Flu Mania. But if they've only got 12.8% of these things are actually the flu, assuming that they are identifying the correct strain. According to their own figures, they are only capable of preventing 10% of those. So even in best case, they're stopping 1.2% of the cases of flu out there, if that's the case. But the other part of this, as you point out, is the dog that did not bark, as Sherlock Holmes would say. What is everybody coming down with if the actual verified numbers of flu cases at the CDC's own figures show that it's actually less than it's been in previous years. What is that?
Yeah, and that's the key, because even at the CDC's website, and we've known this all the way back. Remember back when we had that big anthrax scare, David, back in 2001, and when you started, they were trying to differentiate between some of the anthrax symptoms the early ones are upper respiratory and causing a problem. And so the CDC wrote all of this extensive documentation saying that the anthrax symptoms are not the flu. And then, oh, by the way, the influenza-like illness is not the flu either, because, this time of year when everybody gets sick, because we've had this, it's been really cold here in Cleveland, Ohio, like a lot of places across the country. And when anybody gets sick with upper respiratory type things and a fever, we just as a population just lump that together and call it the flu. And the problem is that we've just kind of used that language so pervasively that we don't really recognize that real flu is only caused by influenza viruses. And influenza-like illness, which, can be like anthrax symptoms like they talked about in 2001. It can be over 200 other types of viruses and bacteria that cause the exact same symptoms. And we call it the flu, but the CDC technically calls it influenza-like illness because it looks like influenza, but it's not. And the tricky part of this is that if you believe in flu shots, if you have the faith that the flu shot's going to keep you from getting sick, it's only going to keep you from getting sick about 12% of the time maximum, because it only prevents you from getting sick from that particular virus.
Wow. That is absolutely amazing. But they've got a large stock of this stuff that they're willing to sell you if you're willing to buy the mainstream media what they're telling you.
People everywhere, get your flu shot, even though the virus this year doesn't match the one that's in the vaccine. They think it's about a 10% match, and the massive amount of illness that's occurring has nothing to do with the influenza virus. But get your flu shot anyways.
Wow. Do you have any idea as to what this might be? I mean, you've talked about how there's a wide variety of things that could cause this. And of course, what we're seeing here could be, a combination of a lot of different things, couldn't it? Anytime somebody gets fever and flu-like symptoms, they're going to call it a flu, and they're going to tell everybody else, go get your flu shot.
Right. And there's two other pieces of that. One is another article that we put up on Baxter a couple of days ago that I got an anonymous letter from a testing center in Virginia that said that the CDC was actually telling them, even if you don't test for the influenza, even if you don't do that rapid strep in the office, and it looks like the flu, report it as flu. So they're driving up the numbers in that way. The other thing is that the rapid flu test that they do in a general office or like an emergency room or an urgent care, it can be accurate as little as 3% of the time. And so there's between 3 and about 25% of the time when you get a swab in a doctor's office that they do the rapid flu, it's accurate. It's inaccurate. Let me rephrase it. It's inaccurate 75% of the time. So they're reporting all this flu, and there are a lot of people getting sick, but we have no idea what the pathogen is because they never test for those other pathogens. They just lump it into the flu. But I suspect that, you've had a lot of stories on InfoWars and on your show, David, about all of the spraying and the chemicals and things that are in the air, all the fires that were happening out in California, and they incinerated plastics and metals and all of those things. And people have crappy diets in the U.S., and people don't get a vitamin D level to make sure that their D is somewhere between 80 and 100 during winter seasons. And we're inside under fluorescent lights. And there's lots of reasons why people are unhealthy and maybe more susceptible to something other than influenza viruses.
Yeah, that's the key thing, is to make sure that your immune system is strong and that you have proper nutrition and so forth. And those are things that you need to be doing anyway for a variety of reasons. That article you're just talking about with CDC accused of inflating flu statistics, and you've got copies of these letters that were sent out in the article, include, if not tested, but prescribed treatment for flu. So even if it's unknown cases, you've got that highlighted here. Absolutely amazing that they're putting this out, deliberately telling people to inflate the cases that are related to flu. And this is coming from the CDC. And they certainly do have the media doing their bidding. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sherry Tenpenny. And again, you can find her. You can find these articles at Vaxter.com, VAXXTER.com. And you can also find information about other vaccine issues that Dr. Tenpenny is studying at TenpennyIMC.com. Also on Twitter at BusyDRT. As in busy Dr. Tenpenny, and she is busy. And she has got the information showing that the actual number of flu cases are less based on their tests, but they're telling people to report it as flu even if it's not verified. We'll be right back. I'm David Knight.